Welcome everyone to the Eureka overview. My name is Craig McNally. Today we'll be looking at what is Eureka, why it was introduced, key features and differences between Okapi and Eureka, summary of the benefits, as well as a little bit of a deeper dive into permissions versus roles, and what is an application, what is a platform, etc. We'll look at the Folio community reception, a little bit of the history behind how this was brought to the community. And then finally, maybe the most important or interesting part is what does this all mean for you? What does Eureka mean for you as a customer, as a system administrator, et cetera? And then finally, we'll wrap things up with a list of links to additional information, presentations, wiki pages, et cetera, as well as some information on how to reach out if you have questions. So what is Eureka? In a nutshell, it's a next generation Folio architecture. It operates at enterprise scale. And at its core, we're basically taking some of the custom developed core components for Folio, like copy and some of the other related modules, and we're replacing those with single purpose, feature rich, best in class open source alternatives. Why? Why would we go through this? Why would we bite all this work off? Well, there are several requirements imposed by some high-profile libraries and consortia who are adopting Folio that would have been extremely difficult to meet on the legacy platform. Compounding that is that a lot of those legacy core components are complex and they're difficult to maintain. And really, there aren't that many people in the Folio community that are familiar enough with that code to really get in there, get their hands dirty, and make the necessary adjustments. So on top of all that, libraries have been asking for features like role-based access controls, improved single sign-on support, and so on for a long time now. So this was an opportunity for us to check those boxes along the way. And then finally, maybe the most important one from a security perspective is authentication, authorization is tricky. It's hard to get correct. Even the experts get it wrong sometimes. So instead of doing that, instead of rolling our own, it's better to leave it up to the security experts, the folks at Keycloak. This is what they do. And that frees us up as a community to work on what we're best at, which is developing library software. So here we have, this is the start of the comparison of Okapi and Eureka. And this is just a really, sort of zoomed in view. On the left-hand side, you can see Okapi at the center of the picture. It's a really hub and spoke model where every single request in the system goes through Okapi, whether it's from an external request from a browser or an internal request going from one module to another. It all goes through Okapi. Okapi is responsible for a lot of different things, including, as you can see here, orchestrating the authorization and tenant checks and so forth. All this stuff is homegrown. A lot of these things have multiple responsibilities. They're complex. They're difficult to maintain. On the right-hand side is the alternative, is Eureka. And you can see that there is no Okapi. It's less hub and spoke model. And instead we have many single purpose components like Kong to start with. That's our API gateway, and it does literally nothing other than route requests and act as an API gateway. We have Keycloak, who it's not routing requests, it's not doing anything other than identity and access management. And so you can see these things are now single purpose. They're open source projects. They're really well trusted software projects. They're really active, multiple releases coming out every year and so forth. And then on the bottom here, one other piece that's worth mentioning, you see the sidecar, who's sits right alongside each of the modules. And this was our way to make it so that not every single module needed to be rewritten or adjusted to be compatible with the Eureka platform. We introduced these sidecars, which allows us to put some hooks in there to perform things like authorization checks. You can see the arrow going to Keycloak there, as well as things like, is this particular module entitled for this application, for this tenant, and so forth. So Yeah, and that's built on the Quarkus framework, another really flexible open source project. Take a step back and look at sort of a closer look at the Okapi platform core and what were some of the components there that I keep on referring to, as well as some of the responsibilities. That's what this shows. So we see a handful of modules on the left-hand side, um, and then in the big gray rectangle here, you have Okapi, and each of these things inside of it, these are all responsibilities. And so you could see now what I was trying to explain as these things are not single purpose at all. Okapi was doing a ton of different things. It was doing API gateway stuff. It was doing filtering. It was doing discovery information, tenant management, timing, like you name it, it was doing it. Um, to contrast that, here's how those same responsibilities map to the Eureka platform. You can see tenant management, for instance, is now handled by a dedicated tenant manager. Similarly, entitlement and tenant permissions are handled by the tenant entitlement manager. The timer responsibility is now handled by a dedicated module mod scheduler, and so forth. To continue on this comparison, we have another image here, another diagram where you can see there's a lot to touch on here. But if we start at the top, we have a user who's interacting with Folio in their browser. Notice the Chrome icon here. Um, the login screen they see is provided by Keycloak. So that's what this authentication error shows. They log in, they're authenticated. Now they're making calls into the Folio backend. Those are all going to Kong, the API gateway, and are being routed to the appropriate sidecars. And the sidecars do those checks that I was mentioning, authorization checks, tenant checks, and so forth, and then sending the request if everything looks good to the module. And then from there, if the module needs to make a call to another module, it again goes out through its sidecar, and the sidecar routes the request directly to another module sidecar. And that works between these applications. I'll touch on the applications in a moment, as well as within the modules in a given application. Last thing on the sidecars are, so as part of those authorization checks, you can clearly see here that there's some interaction between the sidecar and Keycloak. That's a really important important thing to note. It's not the sidecars are performing authorization themselves. That's actually being delegated to Keycloak. The sidecars just provide the hook into that process. And then lastly, up here, we have these manager services, which I kind of touched on the previous slide. This is where we have like the tenant manager, application manager, and tenant entitlement manager. These are single purpose manager services, which do pretty much exactly what they sound like. So the application manager is where you would register applications and the discovery information for those applications. The tenant manager is where you create and manage your tenants. And then the tenant entitlement manager is sort of where those two things intersect. So which applications are entitled for which tenants. And in order to interact with any of these manager services, some authorization is required as well. So that's what this arrow is here. It works similarly to how the sidecar does in that respect. So right, I think I mentioned this earlier, but the modules can, for the most part, remain unchanged. They don't have to do anything to operate on Eureka. And we'll get into applications a little bit more in the coming slides, but in a nutshell, you can see here that an application is essentially just a grouping of several modules into like a logical group. And that might be just one module, or it could be a whole bunch. So to expand on applications and introduce yet another new term, platforms, you can see we'll start at the top left-hand side here. Where the Okapi, you have this mix, this big bag of all the modules, and those could be front-end modules, back-end modules, storage modules, edge modules, whatever it might be, all just lumped in together. With Eureka, we've introduced this notion of an application, which groups those into logical applications. And so these applications are intended to be sort of a vertical slice of functionality. So oftentimes you'll see that an application includes a front-end module, a back-end business logic module, maybe a back-end storage module, and possibly even an edge module, right? Other applications might just have, one or two of those things. So, okay, shifting gears to the bottom of this diagram, and we're going to work from right to left down here. You start with a module. Everyone is probably familiar with the module. Um, in Folio, they have their own module descriptor, their own versioning, etc. Those are grouped into applications, which also have their own application descriptor and their own version. And then those get rolled up into a platform. A platform is essentially a collection of applications. So you might have an application for like the standard LSP, Folio LSP platform, right? Which has, all the applications in their versions for a given flower release, as well as all the versions of the manager services, the versions of Kong and Keycloak, and so forth. So with this platform descriptor, which is versioned and it has its own descriptor, you can then feed that into your automation or your sysops processes to reproducibly stand up a deployment of Folio running the same versions of other components. By contrast, today, a lot of that, we have what's called Platform Complete, which is a GitHub repository, which just has a flat list of all the modules in their versions, which again, sort of, that's what this illustration on the top left-hand side is. All right, permissions and capabilities. One of the main differences with Eureka is that we're not working with permissions anymore. We're working with roles and capabilities, and I'll get into what a role and capability is in a moment. But to sort of refresh our memories on what a permission is, we have on the left-hand side is a snippet of a screenshot showing the permission set area where you can create and manage permission sets in the Okapi-based Folio. And the one thing to note here is that it's a flat list and these are permission sets. So there's some nesting involved there. And one of the key takeaways is it's difficult to determine exactly what you're granting a user when you assign one of these. And I'll get into that a little bit in the next slide. On the right-hand side, you can see roles are comprised of capabilities, and this is just a subset of the screenshot here, showing the list of capabilities, and it's organized into a grid. Roles are not nested, capabilities are not nested, and so what you see is what you get here. It's a lot easier to determine exactly what's being granted to a user. So this is a, believe it or not, simplified version of what permission set landscape looks like on Okapi. So if you start at the bottom, we have API endpoints. Those are protected by what are often referred to as just backend permissions or fine-grained permissions that are required in order to invoke that particular API endpoint. Those are often rolled up into permission sets, either on the back end or by the front end modules. And then those permission sets are often grouped into user-defined permission sets. And so you could see this level of nesting that we have here, which makes it difficult if you're assigning one of these high order permission sets, exactly what's included in that, because there are multiple layers here. And often the same permission can be provided by multiple different routes here. So even if you were to remove one of these permission sets, thinking that you would remove the underlying fine-grained permissions, well, that's not necessarily the case because as shown here, some of those fine-grained permissions are still included via a different permission set. So it gets really complicated, hard to determine exactly what you're granting a user. That was one of the things that we wanted to address with Eureka. So I kind of gave the introduction of roles and capabilities. So I already mentioned roles are a collection of capabilities. And you can see here they also have a name and description. A capability is essentially a resource, something like, circulation loan item, along with an action like view, edit, create, delete, etc. So each of these checkboxes corresponds to a capability. So capabilities are provided by the system. They're not something that you can create. They're where you get that sort of the flexibility to be able to manage things as a library admin is by building your own roles. So there are some roles that will come, sort of default roles that will come out of the box with Eureka. But of course, that's not going to suit everyone's needs, fit your library use case, whatnot. So if you need to customize those or whatnot, you would create your own roles, and that's where that level of customization comes in at the role level, not at the capability level. All right, taking a step back to sort of a summary of benefits. So here, I'm not going to go through this point by point. We have several columns here, each with a different perspective or audience. So what are the benefits of Eureka to the community, to system operators, and to libraries and library users or system admins or whatnot? Um, so just to hit a couple, I think there are a lot of security improvements just by adopting Keycloak. You get a lot of things. You can leverage a lot of features that without having to write much, if any, code at all, right? Um, things like you're now using standard protocols like OpenID Connect and so forth. There's a much better support for SSO, including multiple identity providers. And there's some functionality that we haven't yet leveraged, but is available there, like multi-factor authentication. Um, Also, I just touched on role-based access controls. That's a really important one. We talked about applications that present several benefits, especially on the hosting side. Um, yeah, so take a closer look at this. Let's keep going. Community reception. It all started back in 2024 at WolfCon. We had several sessions related to Eureka. Coming out of that conference, it felt like there was a lot of excitement. A lot of people were on board and willingness to participate in early adopter programs and everything else. So that was really good. It came to the three councils in the Folio community who eventually agreed to adoption of Eureka with Sunflower. And then sort of in parallel to a lot of that, we had this early adopter program going on, which had two different prongs. One was on the hosting provider or SysOps side. And so we had organizations like GBV, Index Data, Texas A&M, and actually there are a few others as well, involved in working with Eureka and what does it mean to get it set up? What adjustments need to be made to infrastructure and automation and everything else. Several of those hosting providers have got to the point where they have a system that's up and running and usable and so forth. So a lot of good feedback throughout that process. And then the other prong was FSC hosted, and it was really end user focused. So um, National Library of Australia and Cornell both got a really early, really rough version of Eureka to play around with from the perspective of an admin or an end user, and we got a lot of good feedback from that. All right, so as I promised in the agenda, I think this might be maybe the most interesting part for a lot of people here. That is, what does Eureka mean for you? What does it require of you? What changes are required, etc. So I tried to summarize in this grid or table up top here with some supporting imagery as well. So to get started, permission set to role migration. I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of nesting with the permissions in Okapi. And then by contrast, we have roles which are inherently flat. So how do you bridge that gap? We have some migration APIs which help do that. And at present, the migration APIs that are available have the sole purpose of, if you had a user that was able to perform some operations on your copy-based folio, after migrating and running these migration APIs, that same user would still be able to perform the same operations, same actions on the Eureka-based system. What you end up getting is what we have down here in the bottom left, where you have a bunch of system-generated roles which make that possible. Unfortunately, it's difficult to name these appropriately because a lot of the permission sets are being combined and flattened out and so forth. And so there is some human in the loop, human intervention required here to clean this up, either by splitting apart these things and renaming them, or by essentially creating new roles off to the side, which are organized the way that you'd like them to be, and then over time migrating your users from the system-generated roles to your user-defined roles, which are organized the way you'd like them. I will say that there's work in progress to improve the migration APIs, the migration experience overall, so that we do sort of maintain some level of that organization, do a better job of mapping permission sets, copy to roles in Eureka. All right, next up, users need to set their passwords. So um, Folio does not store user credentials in plain text. That's obviously a really good thing. What it means is they're not really portable. So with the introduction of Keycloak, that's where your user credentials are stored. We can't just take a password hash from Folio, dump it into Keycloak and expect things to work. It's not going to work. So the upshot of this is that users will need to set their password the first time they log in. The easiest way to do this, I mean, there are a number of different ways to do it in Folio. The easiest way is sort of self-service. So users, they land on the login screen, as you can see on the right here, and they can just use this forgot password feature. So they click on this, you are prompted for some identification, whether it's your email address or username or phone number. You'll get an email with a link, and when you follow that link, you can then set your password. And since it's your first password in Eureka, rules about reusing passwords don't apply here. So if you wanted to reuse your existing password, that's perfectly acceptable. Next up, SSO configuration. If you're familiar with the process of setting up a SAML integration, there's this metadata exchange that needs to happen between the Folio side and the identity provider. And that will need to happen again because it's now Keycloak, which is managing that single sign-on flow, not modlog and SAML. So there's going to be some additional work required there for system operators. Finally, new user provisioning. This is mostly just an FYI, but when you create a user in Folio, it still gets created in mod users. That part hasn't changed. So if you go to the users app in the UI, you create a user, it gets created on the Folio side, not a problem. However, if you're going to be logging in and using Folio, Keycloak also needs to know things about you, right? Like I already mentioned that's where your credentials are stored. It's also where a lot of the authorization happens and so forth. So how does that information get into Keycloak? There's this user promotion mechanism that we have. Essentially, when you try to perform some operations on a user in Folio, assign them credentials or assign them a role, for instance, you'll get a dialog like you see in the bottom right here that says, hey, just so you know, doing this will result in the creation of a user record in Keycloak. And for the most part, it's just for awareness, so you know that, hey, this is actually doing something that you might not have realized was happening. It's most likely perfectly fine to just hit confirm and proceed. But the point is, not every single user needs to live in Keycloak. We by doing this, we avoid sort of bloating Keycloak with a bunch of unnecessary information. Keycloak doesn't need to know about patrons, every single user in the system. That is essentially just data. They only need to know about the users who are actually logging in and using the system. So that's why we've implemented it this way. Finally, what's not on the screen but is asked very commonly, very frequently, is what about external scripts, tools, applications, and so forth? Well, like I have these things, the community doesn't know about them, they're proprietary to my organization, whatever. They talk into Folio. How is that going to be impacted by Eureka? And fortunately, I think the answer is not much at all. So if those scripts, tools, whatever are consuming edge APIs in Folio, the change is absolutely zero. There's absolutely nothing that needs to change. If they're directly calling into Okapi, the only change there is that instead of sending the request to Okapi, you send them to Kong. And for the most part, that can be handled via DNS changes or whatnot within your organization's infrastructure. So in theory, there shouldn't be much of an impact to any of that. All the same login API contracts are honored in Eureka. Refresh token rotation, all that stuff works exactly the same way. So that's going to pretty much do it here. As promised, here's a list of links. Some good WolfCon presentations. The recordings can be found out on the web. They're linked here as well. some good end user documentation on roles management. In fact, a lot of this has been moved over to uh, the Docs Folio site as well for the Sunflower release. So feel free to check this stuff out. And of course, if you have questions, feel free to direct those at myself, cmcnally@ebsco.com, or my colleague Vincent Barreau at vbarreau@ebsco.com. We're also on Teams, we're on Slack. Would be happy to answer your questions. So thank you all. Have a good day.